Good afternoon and welcome to the second webinar of 2021 from the European Centre for Modern Languages of the Council of Europe, a webinar entitled The Future of Language Education, Learning Lessons from the Pandemic. My name is Sarah Breslin and I'm the Executive Director of the ECML. I'm really delighted that so many of you have joined us today. We've had over 2,000 registrations for this webinar from over 70 countries, so a very warm welcome to you all. Before I hand over to our speakers, I'd just like to say a few words about the ECML itself. There may be some of you listening who do not know the Centre. We're an enlarged partial agreement of the Council of Europe based in the beautiful city of Graz, Austria. We work at the interface of policy, research, teacher education and classroom practice in the field of language education, and our mission is to inspire innovation in language learning and teaching, and to support our member states to implement language policies and practices based on the fundamental values of the Council of Europe: democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. How do we do this? Well, we develop a 4-year programme based on identified priorities in our member states, a programme which combines development projects with in-country professional development opportunities and activities for a wider public, such as the European Day of Languages or this evening's webinar. And we also do this by working directly with our member states at the level of national ministries, national organisations and networks in the member states concerned with language education, and of course with individual experts in our member states. But also through partnerships. We have a long-standing partnership with the European Commission, which allows us to undertake additional activities, such as in-country training events in member states of the EU who are not member states of the ECML. Another very important partnership is the one we have with our Professional Network Forum, or PNF for short. The ECML PNF was established in 2012 to provide a platform which would bring together international non-governmental organisations working in the field of language education, so that we can tap into their expertise as we develop and deliver our core programme, learning from one another, looking for synergies, and perhaps launching new joint projects. Today's webinar and the activities that will follow from it is a lovely example of such synergies. Representatives of the different PNF member institutions working together with governing board members on an activity co-funded by the European Commission. As Executive Director, it's a real privilege for me to see how fruitful this multilateral approach can be, and I'd like to thank everyone involved. If you'd like to find out more about the ECML, please visit our website, where you can sign up for our newsletter, the Gazette, and really keep your finger on the pulse on all that's happening in language education. So just a few practical points before I hand over to our speakers. Given the number of participants, it's not possible to allow you to take the floor to ask any questions or make comments. However, we have built in time for comments and questions, so please use the chat function for this. Although the input is in English, you can write your questions in English, French, German or Spanish in the chat. My colleague Catherine Zewald will answer any she can straight away and will relay the questions to me, and I will then relay them to the speakers. So thank you very much once again for joining us, and please enjoy the webinar.
Good afternoon. My name is Frank Hayworth, and I'm a founder member of Equals and a previous consultant at the ECML. Thank you very much for joining the webinar. And I'd like to begin with an introduction to what we're going to do today. I should think for all of you, the last 15 months of the pandemic have been fairly dramatic. For schools, for teachers, and for learners, everybody having to reorganize, to learn new skills, to find new ways of learning and teaching, all in a background with worry and personal restriction and all sorts of confinements. So it's been a long year, a long year and 3 months, and things are not finished yet. The initiative we're presenting today began with the conviction that it was important to record what has happened, this experience during the pandemic, and at the same time to reflect on the consequences for the future of language education. It began with a proposal from some members of Equals, which is one of the members of the PNF, that it would be a good idea to begin with a survey. And it's the survey which we're going to present and the consequences from it in this webinar. We've had an enormous amount of logistic support from the ECML, and the European Union has given it financial support. There's a quotation at the end of this slide which says it's not the strongest of the species that survives, nor the most intelligent, but the one most responsive to change. And I think we'll probably all agree that things have changed in the past, and they're likely to change for language education in the future. In the next slide, I'm going to present the steering group, which is coordinating the project. There's a group of 7 of us, 5 from the Professional Network Forum, 3 of us from Equals, myself, Richard Rossner and Peter Brown, Ben Ruschoff from ILA, and Sabina Schaffner from Circle. So we've got a good representation of different associations linked to language education. Bronca Strauss is the member of the ECML governing board and works in the Ministry of Education in Slovenia, and Pila Peklik has the same things in Estonia. So there's a wide range of expertise from different areas to do with applied linguistics, with university language centers, with language schools teaching things, with people who are responsible for the state and public school sector. In the design of what we present today, the whole of the team has contributed to the content and the design of it, but 1 or 2 of us will not be there because we didn't want a presentation with 10 presenters, because you would perhaps not follow the constant changes. In the next slide, I'd like to tell you something about the survey and what we're doing with it. I suppose the question you might ask, gosh, another survey. What's special about this one? First of all, it's Europe-wide. There are 37 countries, and it's got a very, very broad spectrum of respondents. You'll get more details about it as we present it, but it includes teachers. Over 50% were teachers, with lower secondary teachers as the biggest of all groups. But there are teacher trainers, managers, administrators, testers there. So that's a wider survey than most you'll see. It's special because it's specifically about language education. Most of them deal with the whole experience of what has happened. Here we've tried to concentrate on things which are to do with languages and language teaching and language learning, though of course questions of motivation and social deprivation have come into it. And the third difference is that there are lots of open text questions where respondents were free to express their opinions and their feelings. Very often in surveys, the amount of comment is relatively restricted. Here we've been dealing with a large amount of text. And I'd like to go on to the plan of the webinar now. Apart from the introduction, there are going to be 5 parts to the presentation. 1 by Peter Brown of Equals, a presentation of the results of the survey, and especially on the closed questions which are in it. And then a second presentation dealing with what was in the survey, to do with, we've called it Teachers' Voices, because in the free text there were a large number of presentations of what people felt, what people thought, sometimes good ideas, sometimes encouragement, sometimes anger at what had happened. Perhaps one of the ones which I noticed most was the person who said, "It was awful." In the next section, Bronca Strauss is going to present an analysis of the challenges which have been identified from that. And that will be followed by Bernd Röschow, who will talk about the lessons which we learn for the future, because we feel very strongly that what comes out of it, of the pandemic, is going to change language education. And then I will finish by saying what we plan to do with the rest of the time for this initiative, which will take us to the end of this year and probably into next year. Now, I'd like to look very quickly about what were the main questions. I'm not going to read them out because you can see them very clearly there, but if you look at them, there are three parts of it. One where people have been asked to record their experiences, and we think that's an important part of the survey we've presented, and also what effect it has had on your students' learning success. If I were to criticize ourselves for what we have done with this survey, I think there's one big thing which is missing, is that we've got lots of opinions from teachers, from managers, from administrators, but we haven't been able to ask, for obvious reasons, what the learners themselves have felt about it. And some way we might, in future things, try and look at some sampling of that. We also ask people to assess what has happened to them. We ask them to look to what the lessons are that they've learned from the pandemic. And you'll see that sometimes they're technical lessons, sometimes they're lessons about methodology, but they go quite deeply into the way people have lived through the pandemic. And finally, we ask people to predict what is going to happen. We think there's probably not going to be a new normal, but that we like people to say, well, you know, what is going to happen next? And on the next slide, we'll look at the information we gather. There are two kinds of information, some from the closed questions where we ask people, you'll see statistical results, pie charts and different things about how it has affected teaching methods, about technical support, about training, about steps taken to cope with learners' stress. And these are things which come out, but we also have the open text responses where we have, as Peter will explain to you, a vast amount of text where people have said what they felt, what they thought, and what they see as the consequences of the pandemic. So thank you very much for listening. I'll hand you over to Peter Brown now, who will present a survey of the results of the survey. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frank. I'm just going to share my screen with you. It's actually a sort of snapshot overview of some of the key points. Let's bring that up to full, and I hope you can all see it. The usual chat that you get with Zoom. One of the things that I think we need to focus on is the fact that this is very much work in progress. We had a huge amount of data from many countries in the world, and some of the data was very easily decoded, whereas some of it, you'll see, we still need to interlink and correlate. The focus was on Europe, and we had a very, very good geographical distribution within Europe. Perhaps I'd just like to draw your attention to two items. One is the completion rate. Now, in my experience, 100% completion rate is very rare, and over 1,735 responses is almost exceptional. The other thing I'd like to draw your attention to is the amount of time people dedicated. On average, each and every respondent dedicated 30 minutes. If you put all that together, that's the equivalent of 6 working months. So a big thank you to everybody who took the time to respond and to respond in such detail. Now, what kind of institutions? It's not enough just to have good geographical distribution. You also need to have good demographic distribution and institutional distribution. This particular slide is looking at the institutions that people come from or work in. And we can see from this, if you look at the blue segment on the lower right, that the majority of respondents came from lower secondary. But if you look at the same segment on the other side, nearly the same amount of people came from upper secondary. And you can see all the segments are quite large. So we knew from this and other slides, which I can't show you at the moment because of lack of time, that we had good geographical distribution, and we've got very good demographic distribution. So where does that take us? We need to know one other thing before we move on. That's how long people have been working in language education. And as you can see, more than 82% responded that they had more than 10 years experience. Now, that's important to balance and offset by the number of people who are at an earlier stage in their career. And you'll see from this slide that some 300 respondents were at this earlier stage. This is important when we begin to correlate the open items, the ones that my colleague Pilar will be talking about a bit later on. Another thing that we looked at was the before-after situation with the pandemic. This particular before-after, or before-during actually, in this case, we were looking at language teaching techniques and the learning tasks used by the teachers. And we invited people to say what they thought, and they ticked various boxes. And we invited them to tick more than one box if they wanted to. And of course, if you invite people to do that, they do just that. So 27% said that their lessons have been more difficult to plan, and that would be understandable. 24% said that their techniques and their teaching techniques have changed significantly. But because you can tick more than one box, we have 22% who said that their lessons have become more varied and more motivating due to the constraints. They've had to become more creative. And linking this data and then linking this data, which in some ways might seem contradictory, but linking this data then with the comments is one of our major tasks that we're going to be doing in the near future. One of the things that we looked at was receptive and productive language skills. We looked at this actually in some detail. And one of the questions is, well, what have learners done more during the period of the pandemic? And equally, what have they done less? Now, this is a typical representation of Likert scales. These are scales where you can say, we do more of this or less of this. I prefer that rather than the other, and so on and so forth. And one thing when you're looking at spidergrams is you're looking to see how symmetrical they are. If they're very symmetrical, doesn't matter what shape, but if they're very symmetrical, then people are in broad agreement that all the items are roughly equally important. If there are slight changes in it, then you see they're scaling them and saying, this is more important than that, or I believe this is more useful than that, or whatever the question happens to be. In this particular case, you do have to be careful because of the way the scales are constructed. This appears to show that there were less grammar explanations during the pandemic. And this one appears to show that there were more group discussions. But this is an inverse scale. And if you look at the detail, you see that there were fewer group discussions. That item was the smallest one. So you do have to be careful when you're looking at these spidergrams to look at the detail that comes underneath. They're only a partial representation of the respondents' views. The details count in spidergrams, and they come below, underneath. One of the things that we particularly ask people is that since the beginning of the pandemic, my language teaching has been, and 38% said that it was sometimes remote and sometimes face-to-face. And following that, there were lots of challenges because, as you can appreciate, changing from one to the other and adapting is very difficult. 30% responded that it was mainly remote. And in that remote context, some 28% said that their teaching was synchronous, doing it at the same time. and only 3% were saying that it was asynchronous. And that's an interesting response. Again, you need to look down in the detail that follows afterwards. So naturally, one of our next questions was, well, tell us about hybrid learning. Now, this question actually turned out to be problematic, and in a second and better life, we perhaps rewrite it. What we had was that 53% of the respondents, judged it to be less effective. So they felt that hybrid learning had some problems and it was less effective than the other forms that they could choose. Importantly, and what saved this question, is that 1 in 3 of all correspondents added a comment. That's some 600 comments. And we were able to anchor the data with the comments. And we did that very, very quickly. And we're going to do it in a more sophisticated, more detailed manner in future. But we looked very broadly who agreed, who disagreed, and what sort of statements they were making. And that's something that you can do quite quickly. So there we have it, this concern that there are some significant limitations to hybrid learning. Then we asked about examinations, testing, and assessment. It's an inevitable one. And 62% recorded and reported that there's been a reduced reliability of exams. Now, there are all sorts of issues here, and this is where you need to correlate with the sector and the amount of experience that people have. For example, you wouldn't be expecting a reply like this from primary. You might well be expecting a reply like this from higher education. Then we looked at, well, you all know very well that a lot of examinations had to be cancelled. What was the effect of cancellation on the motivation of learners? And some 60% reported that learner demotivation cropped up because of cancellation. Learners being demotivated because they couldn't do the exam. Again, you need to look at the detail of where these answers are coming from. Frank mentioned, and you'll hear more mention later on, of the comments that people contributed. We had over 4,150 comments to 15 specific questions. The top 7 are here. These top 7 are in descending order. I'm not going to read them. You can see for yourselves. And many of them are roughly the same order of magnitude, about 600 comments or a little bit more. And that covers 92%. These top 7 cover 92%. And this is where we need to correlate them. It's very important that we all understand that many of the comments on challenges, difficulties, looking forward, testing issues cropping up, didn't just occur on the question that was specific to that point, but they cropped up in lots of other places. For example, under important lessons learned, or under positive aspects, or under time and timings. And so we need to understand, and this is what makes it complicated to unpack the data, that these questions don't need just to be looked at horizontally, just that question, and they're not to be judged and assessed as single items, but they need to be interrelated sometimes to each other. Not all of them work like that, and sometimes to their anchor data. And that's very important and demanding to do. For example, one of the most important questions is, well, are these comments in any way representative? And if they are, of what are they representative in particular? So this is the sort of work that we'll be doing in the coming months, looking at how we can anchor open comments in the data, because otherwise they're just comments and you might as well pick them at random. But we're doing it in, we hope, a slightly more systematic manner. But it's demanding and it takes a lot of time. Let's look at the changes in the organization of institutions. Well, of course, the big changes was in the working conditions of teachers, but there were other changes and we wanted to break that down and have a look at them in detail. One of the things that cropped up in many of the comments was the amount of time that had been allotted to working remotely with learners. Now, this was a question that came up and it was linked to other questions. So do you have enough time? Did you have enough time? 47% in a previous question, which I've not shared with you, said that they did not have as much time as they'd had pre-pandemic. They had less time to work with their learners. Nevertheless, some 50% felt that on the whole, it was sufficient and productive for some of the learners, but not all of them. But if we look above that, we can see that some of them are saying that it was sufficient and productive for the whole class. And that I think we probably didn't expect. It's 15% who said that. And then some 18% were saying, well, no, it was less productive for the whole class. And this is another very good example of where you need to correlate this data with other data. What about learner achievement and progress? This was important because some 41%, this blue segment at the bottom, said that it had been somewhat reduced, but a surprising percentage, 26%, said that it was more or less the same as it would have been otherwise. And again, we need to unpack that and to see why that was so and see what we can learn from it going forward. What about the impact on our practice and what we see carrying over into the future when the pandemic is hopefully over? The comment that had the greatest consensus, and it was a considerable degree of consensus, is this one at the bottom. I'll unpack it for you. This is 55%. Roughly 55% of all the respondents said the replacement of tests and formal exams by continuous assessment has overall had a positive effect, especially in reducing stress on learners. And this whole idea of balancing out summative and formative assessment is something that we want to look at and share with you. Have we been able to maintain the quality and variety of our learners' language learning experiences and above all, their achievement? Some 23% disagreed or disagreed strongly with this statement. No, they have not been able to do it. But some 55% agreed or agreed strongly. The big blue segment is those who agree, and above it you'll see the agree strongly. That relationship, that ratio, is more than 2 to 1. Agreed or agreed strongly with that statement. They've been able, in spite of all the difficulties, all the challenges, to maintain achievement. And I think that's a tribute to the dedication of all our teachers. Briefly, some take-home messages. Well, we have a very well-distributed and rich, not always well-distributed, I'll show you one example, exception in a minute, but on the whole, we have well-distributed and rich data set. It provides anchorage, so we can link into numeric data and we can link the comments so they're just not floating free. That gives us a greater sense of reliability, and if we've got reliability, then we have validity for the comments. They're not just plucked out of thin air. I like that one or don't like that. Some things were not evenly distributed, however, and that is we had respondents from over 40 countries. The top 5 covered 70% of the replies. These are those in descending order: Greece, Romania, Italy, Spain, and Germany. And the top 2, Greece and Romania, accounted for over 50%. So from one point of view, well done, Greece and Romania. From another point of view, boy, did you give us a headache, because we had to isolate some of the information, rework it, see if you brought in skew and bias, and so on and so forth. But a very, very impressive range of countries. As you might well have expected, the pandemic has had a very significant impact on a range of things. That impact is usually problematic, it's usually negative, but not always. As I said and showed you on that earlier slide, 55% saying we've maintained the quality of our language learners' learning experiences, and we've maintained their achievement objectives. That's very impressive. Very often, and it makes it challenging when you're looking at the data, being teachers, of course, I'm a teacher, we all tend to say positive and then the negative. We balance things. We say this, but on the other hand, you can see that. and there was very broad equilibrium between the positives and the challenges that we have to face. Not all doom and gloom. The greatest focus, the one that attracted the most comments, had been the lessons learned by adapting to change. And that's important. Our own next steps are going to be to analyze these correlations further using various techniques and look how we can contribute towards the outcomes. One final thing, and it's a very important final thing, a huge thank you to all the respondents, because without you, we couldn't have done this. And the quotation up above is from the wonderful Irish poet Seamus Heaney, which to me seems to encapsulate what all of you told us. So thank you very much, and hand over now to, stop sharing, my colleague Pila.
Yes, thank you, Peter. Hello to everyone from me as well. It's a great privilege to talk to you today and to be able to reflect back to the community the voices that we could see in the responses, and really to just for a few minutes to focus in on your opinions and feelings and experiences. This is to flesh out some of the statistics that you've just seen, but I will just start with a caveat that this is, of course, the very first glance. As Peter referred, there are so many comments and there's so much to go through. So this is just the very first look into it. And I will start with an even shorter glance at this very short glance on my next slide, which really encapsulates the shortest responses that I could find, which in themselves, in a certain extent, to a certain extent, might just be enough. So if you just look at these little bubbles, you actually get the gist of the emotions that were involved. So you can see different reactions to the situation that developed. You can see the assessment of it, that people who felt they were not prepared, that being fearless and needing to adapt were in people's minds. The teachers are amazing, that which none of us can certainly argue against. But I'm not going to wrap it up here. Instead, I will quickly take you through 5 main categories that, for me at least, emerged in the comments that you gave in response to the lessons learned. And I'm going to start with this very broad category of what is the verdict when it comes to online teaching or hybrid teaching. And as I go through my slides, I will start with the positives and then bring out the downsides that you pointed to. So trying to follow this equilibrium that was just referred to. So when it comes to the process as a whole, there were many, many comments about people finding that the experience isn't or hasn't been so bad. There were people who enjoyed having to use their wits and leave their comfort zones, and they felt that people had gotten a confidence boost and have really explored for themselves and discovered something that they didn't know they would be capable of. The downside of it, of course, is this stress, frustration, the sense of impersonality that accompanied this process. And I guess this is characteristic to language learning in particular. A lot of the respondents really grieved for this loss of face-to-face contact. So this was evident, even in comments that suggested that they would much prefer having an online lesson rather than having their students sit in masks and not being able to see their faces. So there are mixed feelings, but both positive and negative ones. The key words being for the whole process: inequality, lack of time, and the idea of challenge, whether one enjoyed it or not. Alongside this challenge comes stress, which is the second category that I wanted to draw out for you from the comments and from reading them. And the issue becomes how you manage to cope with it. So those of you who managed to solve the puzzle of this constant stress found out that they could make it work. And I really like the quote from this self-described new teacher who said that they adopted the you do not need any more stress this year attitude. And a lot of you had realized that what you actually need in this time is more tolerance and more patience and more understanding for your students and for yourselves, for your colleagues. The downside, of course, is the exhaustion that has accompanied this process, physical, mental, psychological. There were a lot of comments about the really the sheer lack of time, the extra work that was required from both teachers and learners, and really quite often the sheer physical toll that it takes to spend all of those lessons in front of a computer or a difficult, constrained physical situation. The next category that emerged for me in this first round of reading was certainly a very emotional one. I've titled it Support or Lack of It. And there was a wealth of comments that spoke about the communities of teachers coming together, of the national bodies being able to provide seminars, free classes, and a lot of you had really found that there was great space for professional growth and to really develop your skills. On the other hand, some of the most emotional comments came from respondents who felt that they had been left on their own. There were often certain countries mentioned, but it still seemed to cut across the geographical locations. A lot of you commented on the feeling of having been left completely alone, and people who were supposed to be taking decisions not being willing to do so. And the issue of well-being in connection to that for both students and teachers, and the lack of support to dealing with these as well. So the, I guess, discourse of self-reliance and the need for training and support was very evident from your responses on this point. Another issue that became very clear and was very interesting to read through actually was the understanding of control or authority, or just being able to be in the pilot's position. And I think this is something that's very part of having the role of the teacher, feeling responsible for what is happening in the classroom. On the positive side, many of you had found ways of letting go of this need or this feeling, and commented on being able to leave students to do the work amongst themselves, and to also having been able to find new ways of assessing students, not really relying on traditional tests as such, and realizing, I guess, that learners are the main characters of the process. Still, and this is why I use the word control in the headline as well, because it was a very recurrent term, and it was evident that teachers and the respondents, really you, had a great sense of responsibility to each and every student going through the process and being able to control for it, being able to, in a mental way, put your hand on the problem, on the student, and to guide them, and the, again, feeling the lack of being able to do so. And also the issue of honesty. Assessment will be addressed later on today, but this basic category of being able to trust your students, that they would be honest in their work, also cropped up as a concern for you. And the final topic that I want to address, and this really links to this having a sense of control and being able to check up in a way on the learning process, has to do with student motivation and how you felt that this had changed, or how they were engaging with you. Again, a lot of you realized or re-realized, as I said earlier, the main goal of teaching, which is to keep students' motivation high. But I have to say that, as Frank was pointing to earlier, this is something that you in a way put a time limit on. There were many comments about the fact that yes, we can do this, the students can do this, we can do this, but to a point and not forever. But of course, we know that this forever is currently still ongoing. And then teachers rediscovering the limits of their role, and I've put it on the positive side because they realized that they need to put more emphasis on the students themselves. On the downside, again, a lot of you felt that students had it easier hiding when they don't have to put their cameras on. So this is an issue of an emerging etiquette for online learning, and that students really sometimes resisted this added autonomy that was being pushed on them. So as a summary, maybe just keywords that were really apparent, the understanding and the need to adapt, the issue of well-being for all of the participants, and the issue of growth, whether you have enough room and resources to grow and to help your students grow. So this was the very first look into this ongoing process and your emotions to it. I know that if we have questions, we'll break for them now, but other than that, I would hand you over to Bronca.
Thank you very much to our previous speakers. I think we perhaps could take a little break at the moment for the simple reason that the chat has been exceptionally busy. I'm not going to be able to relay all of your comments and even your questions, because many times they were really, you were asking each other as a community of people involved in language education. I think the questions were perhaps not necessarily directed at the team of presenters, but just some of the main comments that are coming through. And apologies if I've missed a particular comment anyone has made. Someone said quite early on that the distribution of teaching levels really make this a very relevant survey. So that's very reassuring and nice to hear. There was another comment about the 4 skills and the 4 skills being of equal importance. But what really sort of sparked comments and questions was the whole issue of hybrid learning. What do we mean by hybrid learning? And what is the link between hybrid learning and what some people have referred to as self-learning or autonomous learning? So just 1 or 2 comments. We're not at all surprised that teachers found hybrid learning less effective, because if they'd not been trained to set it up or to use it, then inevitably it would be less effective. So really the comment there is not hybrid in itself, it's the lack of training in being able to use it both at a technical level and to exploit it pedagogically. Someone else said, well, hybrid learning is less effective, but of course, it was simply a necessity because of the health crisis. And that then led to the question, do we really understand what hybrid learning and teaching is all about? And I'm just looking now, 1 or 2 comments. In our university, we teach languages only online. And here is a comment, here is a question. I think an open question. If ministries of education took the necessary safety measures, for example, with less students in class, would it be better to have physical lessons or not? And that led then to a thread along the lines of, well, it helps learners to prepare for self-education, it develops learner autonomy. And then a question about, well, yes, that's maybe fine for older learners. How does it work with younger learners? And I think these are important questions which we need to think about. Christina Cunningham from the Commission has pointed people in the direction of an EU Commission report, Lessons Learned and Guidelines for Blended Learning, which has been produced in collaboration with several ministries of education. And we have a comment that in Greece, 20 to 30% reduction of the material for the university entrance exams. So exams have been really affected by the pandemic. And a lovely one for you, Peter, echoed by many people. Grazie Peter per la chiara e ricca presentazione. So some very nice feedback. Now there's one question here which I don't think is for our team. I think it's more of an open question for the languages community. In the UK, there is a process to reform the content of GCSEs, So that's the courses and the examinations taken around the age of 16 at the end of compulsory education in modern foreign languages. The proposal is to move from topics to high frequency words. Any thoughts from colleagues in other countries? So if anyone can chip in the chat and provide an answer to that particular very interesting and very challenging question. I don't think I can cover anything else right now, but it's a very, very busy chat, and we will certainly save all of the messages that are going on in the chat. So with that, I'll hand over now to Bronka. Thank you.
So good afternoon. A warm welcome from Ljubljana, Slovenia. In my short presentation, drafted with Sabina Schaffner, I will try to show some of different issues stemming from hundreds of responses gathered under the open question concerning challenges to face. Having used a tool that counts words and the frequency of appearance, these are the words or phrases that were most frequently associated with the challenges. Somehow the winner is reliable internet connection, followed by motivation, inclusion, assessment, effective teaching, new ways, autonomous learning, stress, contacts, of course, lack of contacts. But let me go directly to the most universally expressed challenge, technology and its aspects. On the one hand, there is an urgent need for appropriate IT equipment and reliable internet. We have all experienced stress and problems with unstable connections. On the other hand, the respondents said that the equipment was often guaranteed, but there was no one to help learners to use it. So helplines and other ways of support need to be introduced. To go on, some teachers were better prepared for switching to the online education than others, of course, but nevertheless, all teachers need additional teacher training in developing digital competencies. Even those who already developed these competencies in the past can share their expertise and find ways to upgrade it. Then students, they need digital competencies as well, but they also need to become more autonomous and should take a more active part in classroom activities. Concerning the approaches to online teaching, we should develop digital teaching scenarios, efficient ways to learn with the technology, create learning environments that help learners, see clearly the difference between online and classroom didactics, and so on. And especially, we should explore ways to increase and maintain students' motivation, which has already been said several times today. Curriculum and rethinking the curriculum. There was, for example, a suggestion that we should reflect upon which objectives of the language education curricula are the most suitable for online teaching, and of course, which are less. And finally, a set of suggestions emerged for how to develop and provide new teaching and learning interactive resources, if possible, collaboratively. There was also an idea to create a common database on either national or regional level, depending on how the education is organized. And of course, we need to maintain an efficient balance between using textbooks and authentic materials that can be found on internet. Apart of the issues of technologies, there are other challenges. The majority of respondents shared their concern about how to include all students, how to maintain access and equal opportunities, how to support students with learning difficulties, how to create safe and inclusive environment. Then there was a part concerning effective language education, pointing out the challenges of assessment, of finding creative and efficient ways for oral and written production, and for creating such tasks or exams that will reflect the students' true language skills. As languages cannot be learned in isolation, as one respondent said, many voices were concerned about the problem of providing communication and assuring meaningful interaction. Coping with the pandemic requests flexibility, adaptiveness to constant change, but also breaking through the resistance to change. The pandemic has brought about stress, anger, fear, burning out, insecurity about the future, and other negative feelings. The crucial challenge is how to support teachers and learners to regain trust and positive attitude. The traditional roles of teachers, students, and parents have been changing constantly for quite some years now. But the pandemic has greatly accelerated this process. The challenge is how to define these roles anew, and especially how to manage the expectations of everyone concerned. As I work at the Ministry of Education, I took a look at the challenges from a different perspective, and I could recognize those that should be addressed at the systemic level, primarily in creating space, providing a legal framework, and funds to equip schools, teachers, and students with suitable and reliable devices. Vouchers were mentioned several times as a possibility. Then to provide relevant teacher training, to revise language curricula, to create space for developing efficient common approaches to online education and assessment. The higher education perspective. 3 topics emerged: assessment and how to find ethically acceptable ways of carrying out reliable summative assessment. This means creating the right balance between, on the one hand, exercising excessive control over students and building trust on the other hand. In addition, we need to implement valid, reliable means of continuous assessment as a standard supplement to summative assessment. And this was already mentioned before. The next challenge would be how teachers can find ways to give students regular and constructive individual feedback. And last but not least, how to support interaction and plan group activities for language production by giving clear instructions and choosing the most appropriate teaching methods for different language tasks. To conclude my part of the presentation, as difficult as the pandemic seems with all ramifications, every coin has 2 sides. And I'm happy that I can hand the floor over to Bernd, who will present the brighter side of the pandemic.
Okay, here we go. Thank you very much, Bronca. Obviously, a bit of a contradiction in terms when talking about the brighter side of the pandemic, but as Peter suggested earlier, there are a number of things that can be learned from the comments made by participants. First of all, obviously a word of thanks to Richard Rossner, as we both collaboratively compiled this part of the presentation. As said earlier, the richness both in qualitative and quantitative data is immense, and obviously making it possible for us to truly triangulate and further interpret the data in an anchored and in a balanced fashion. As the data suggests, many correspondents Many respondents shared the view that face-to-face teaching is irreplaceable. Still, several found, to their surprise, that there were lessons to be learned for their future teaching from the experience of working online. In general, we can assume that for a large number of teachers, even those who found online teaching stressful and unsatisfactory, the experience will have some long-lasting impact on their teaching. That's what the comments suggested, whatever the circumstances. Aspects mentioned concerning things teachers appreciated suggest issues such as greater relevance and real-world connection in their classroom due to the use of technology, as it related better to the world and the real-world experience of the learners, as well as more flexibility in classroom practice and classroom management. If we look at the next slide, for many, assessment was the main challenge when teaching during lockdown. And at the top of the slide, you see just a few of the reasons mentioned. But again, quite a few believed that the reduction in formal testing was a good thing. And it was less stressful for students to be assessed and receive feedback on their learning in a continuous and less formal way. Overall, there seems to be an increase now in appreciation that a more balanced approach between summative final and ongoing formative assessment, including also learner involvement in assessment, self-assessment, etc., might be fairer and potentially positively impact progress, learning competence, and learner motivation. Again, looking at the next aspect, contrasting views, if I can have the next slide, please, as to this issue, because some respondents were very concerned about the divide between the more motivated and the less motivated learners, as well as between those with less and with more privileged home circumstances, infrastructure available, etc., etc. This apparently, obviously, becomes more tangible when working online and being forced to work in an online context. Others took the view that, challenging as the situation may be, it is the teacher's responsibility anyway, with support of course, to find solutions to this. After all, the divide in concentration span, in motivation, in ultimately learning gain also exists in face-to-face teaching as well, even though it is more keenly felt and at first more challenging to cope with in online contexts. Overall, a large number of teachers see potential to learn, figuratively speaking, a few new tricks of the trade, so that in future they can benefit from the use of technology in order, as one statement put it, to help students to get more involved in the process of learning. Normalization, as indicated on the next slide, is something that was added to the discussion by Stephen Bax in the early 2000s when it came to reflecting on how to stimulate ways of using technology as a natural ingredient in language teaching and language learning. Consequently, one question that might, and we will most certainly want to follow up on, is whether the pandemic has in a way confirmed normalization. As far as technology in general is concerned, feedback confirmed, if we look at the next slide now, that on the one hand, normalization is a fact of social life and digital potential is appreciated by teachers. However, a lot of teachers referred to the gap between their own real world outside school and the school context and the educational context themselves. As we see here, teachers often saw the need to use their personal private resources as a stopgap to compensate lack in institutional infrastructure and resources. And as Bronca just suggested, that's where the administrators and those in charge, so to speak, need to step in. However, the situation was by some perceived as a welcome opportunity as well to try out new things and to experiment with technology to positively impact teaching and learning, as the next slide shows. What was said so far is obviously closely related to existing digital knowledge and expertise, as can be seen from the first quote. Again, this aspect, and we heard that before, is not limited to teachers. We often assume that learners, as supposed digital natives, can handle technological challenges without a problem. But this was clearly addressed as a myth by the teachers in a number of comments, who also observed that students did actually face challenges when having, when having to cope with digital learning environments. But teachers also identified a number of positive effects on learning and on learners. For example, the greater ease with which learners communicated in digital spaces, so in kind of potentially perceived as safe spaces. And also the variety of ways in which learners could be better included and integrated into learning initiatives in hybrid and distance learning scenarios. Teachers also appreciated the opportunity for professional growth and clearly see the need to, as pointed out earlier, in the future, to keep using technology to create more flexibility in learning and learning within and outside institutional settings, and building bridges between these two sectors and areas. This includes future open-minded attitudes towards enlightened forms of hybrid learning arrangements, as the next slide suggests. This is very much confirmed by how teachers commented on hybrid learning arrangements beyond the statistical figures presented by Peter earlier on. And it's a good example of how we need to anchor and correlate the qualitative comments and the quantitative statistical data, because a lot of teachers basically perceived hybrid learning as, this quote says, une expérience assez stressante, mais fantastique. So the quotes on this slide are representative in a way and indicative of teachers' attitudes as to the fact that combining school learning and remote learning does in fact offer some advantages which could be useful after the pandemic. As a byline, and this is truly just a byline, one point that came up several times in the comments was the convenience for teachers and for students of not having to travel to classes, issues such as time saving, cost saving, better for the environment, students from further away being able to be integrated into the learning process, etc., etc. As far as the future is concerned, if we move on to the next slide, as said above, teachers identified clearly the need for professional growth, and they wanted to become involved and be afforded the opportunity to develop their skills and to become better teachers in terms of using technology, etc., etc. And as the last quote on this particular slide suggests, they also appreciate and see the need to build communities of practice, i.e. networking as it takes place today was very much appreciated and seen as one way of improving and increasing professional growth and initiatives made available for professional growth after the pandemic. Okay, where do we go from here? That is the question now. So if we look at the next slide, what we're planning to do, we have a wealth of quantitative statistical data, and we have a huge amount of qualitative open statements and comments. And this will allow us to look in more detail behind seemingly clear-cut percentage figures and further triangulate and balance quantitative results with qualitative input. One initiative we're working on at the moment is to compile all the open comments into a corpus, into a very differentiated and clearly structured corpus, using a tool called the Corpus Presenter, made available by a colleague of mine at my home institution. A word of thanks to Ray Hickey here, who makes this tool available to us, to make such qualitative data quantifiable. So, and allow for detailed and differentiated analysis of statements contributed. We will, by the way, also try to integrate the comments and the chat statements into this corpus, because they will be very valuable when trying to look beyond the statistical data collected so far. All this done, of course, in an anonymous and data protection relevant fashion. This will then allow us to, and we will attempt to do so, to properly fine comb and correlate all the nuggets of wisdom provided by participants to the survey. And the whole team, as Peter already suggested, is grateful to all who contributed to the survey. The next steps, as identified by Frank earlier on, will also try to sort of look a bit more beyond the data and at the data from different perspectives. So the question is, of course, which educational sector is involved. So statements made as to hybrid learning might differ and have different emphases when looking at them from a primary, secondary, advanced, tertiary, etc. point of view. We will also have to try to take into consideration which professional context contributors came from and do come from, who contributed to the survey. So all these are things that we'll look at in the next steps of analyzing the survey. And what's going to happen then in practical terms as to follow up and further think about what we were able to compile into the survey is something that Frank will now inform you about. So I hand over to Frank, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Bernd, for all your comments. I would just very briefly, as a conclusion, like to say what the next steps are, because this webinar is not at the end of an initiative, but the second step in 5 events. The survey was done in February. We've had our webinar, which is within 5 minutes of being over, and this will be followed by 2 think tanks, one in May and one in September. The think tanks are going to, as everybody has said, first of all, carry out the much more detailed analysis of the data, the very rich amount of data that we've got. And secondly, what we want to do is to apply it to do something useful, which will help meet the challenges which have been raised there. Useful things like identifying good practice, like finding out what the exact problems we have to meet, and to see how the contributions which have been made or from further study will allow us to do it. And these will be part of a colloquium to be held, it is hoped, face-to-face in Graz at the end of the year, in which the ECML will be giving a review of all the work that has been done during the year. I would say the journal of the plague year, like Daniel Defoe said in 1660, what has been done at the ECML, and that will be followed by a publication which will need to be ready for December. Could we go to the next slide, please? And what we want to achieve is, first of all, we think it's extremely important that there should be an accurate record of what language teaching has done during the pandemic through the analysis and study of the data I've talked about, and a guide to successful practices used during the pandemic that can be applied in, inverted commas, normal times, which we all hope will come. And we think that things are not going to stay as they were before the pandemic, and therefore perhaps we can give some approaches to a rethink of language education, taking account of what we've all experienced in the pandemic. And finally, before I hand over to Sarah, we've created a website which is going live now, where you will find, well, once we finish the content of this webinar, the background to it and resources, and we want to build this up during the year. So thank you to all my colleagues for everything which has been said, and I will hand over to Sarah to conclude the webinar.
Thank you very much, Frank, and thank you to all our speakers. I can't begin to relay all the comments in the chat. but many of them are just huge thank yous to all our speakers. So that's really, really lovely to read. What I will do is I will go to one comment and one question. And if perhaps the various members of the team could have their cameras on and be there in case you would like to answer the question. But I'll begin with what I think is one of the many lovely comments in the chat. All language teachers from around the world coming together to discuss their teaching experience during the pandemic is like Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. Now there's a lovely one. And here's an interesting question coming from our former colleague, Hanna Komorowska. Hanna, delighted to know that you're with us. Is it possible to see two sets of diagrams, one for Greece and Romania and two for the other countries taken together, considering responses from the first two formed half of the overall responses? So that's one question which I'll keep in the air for a moment. And then there's another question. I wonder if the survey highlighted socioeconomic differences and gaps with access to technology on the part of learners. Would anyone like to respond to any of those questions?
May I?
Please.
Just taking Hannah's first question, it's absolutely appropriate. What we decided to do when we saw this preponderance of replies from two countries was to look at each of the top 5 countries individually, to look at those two, Greece and Romania, take them out and see what the rest of the survey looks like. And we also decided to look if there may be north-south issues. Now, we don't want to get involved in geopolitics and all the rest of it, but we just wanted to see if there were regional variations in the responses. So it is something that we'd already taken on board and we are going to do, and we will publish those results. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Bernd, please.
Yeah, just very briefly to follow up on that. I mean, in fact, the corpus that we're going to build will allow us to do exactly that, because it's not just going to be a huge lump of text that we compile into the corpus, but we will compile the corpus in such a way that we can look at the overall picture, but we can also look at sectors and individual subparts of the corpus. So, for example, demographic, geographical, etc. differentiation. So that will be a very, very flexible way of looking at the different perspectives, also as far as the qualitative data is concerned.
Okay, Frank, please. Frank, could you turn on your microphone?
There were very many comments relating to the problems of socially disadvantaged groups. Numbers of them relating to the difficulties of migrant children, especially those who didn't have the language of distance learning at home, and saying how difficult it was for them, especially compounded by the fact of not having frequently suitable technological material to do it. There were relatively few but important ones about how adult migrant language learning, as somebody said, had more or less disappeared during the pandemic in the particular context of that response. So I think a lot of the respondents were really very, very conscious of that difficulty. And I think the problem of integration and assimilation of all learners is going to be one of the enormous challenges which will be faced at the end of the pandemic.
Thank you, Frank. Yes, there are several comments about that, about not making sure no one is left behind. And I think that's probably one of the main challenges. I think we know that this pandemic has put the spotlight on social and economic and linguistic divides that already existed and has in some ways exacerbated them. Beyond that, really, most of the comments are within the community, people sending people towards different reports and resources, which is really nice. It's nice to see that the chat is an active community of practice. And really people talking about how there have been positives and negatives, just as the survey results have shown. I think that an overall agreement that assessment has been one of the main challenges that the pandemic has thrown the spotlight on. Someone is asking if the corpus is going to be made available. Would anyone like to answer that question?
I presume that's under the auspices of the ECML, because obviously it's material compiled on behalf of the ECML, and whether that corpus can then be made public or made available publicly, that's something that maybe the ECML has to decide. The only thing that I can say is that the way we compile the corpus will ensure that it's absolutely anonymous and it's absolutely untraceable. So if anybody uses the corpus, you cannot identify particular comments, statements, and correlate them with particular individuals who contributed, or even countries, etc., in an open machine. It's all anonymous. So, but that's something to think about.
Okay, I don't think that's something we would make a decision on right at this moment. We need to see the further analysis, and then we can consider whether or not that would be in the public's interest to share that data, which of course would all be anonymized. I'm not seeing any other direct questions, but a very, very interesting chat. And I was really pleased, Bernd, to see that you would look at that material from the chat as a complementary source of data to the survey findings. So nothing is lost, because believe me, my eyes can't go quickly enough scrolling through the emails. I can't catch them all. So I'm glad it's been saved in a more systematic way. It really only remains for me to say an enormous thank you to the team behind this initiative. First of all, for just coming up with the idea, but for the enormous amount of work that has been put into it, and for what I think has been a very, very professional and interesting and stimulating presentation today. So thank you to everyone for joining us and for listening. The conversation doesn't end there, as Frank has said, but please just get in touch with the ECML if you have any questions or anything you would like to add to the conversation that's being on today. And we will, of course, make the recording available for anyone who was not able to join us today through YouTube. It will be available almost immediately after the presentation closes. Any final remarks from our team, or shall we simply draw this to a close? Yeah, great. Thank you very much, everybody. Goodbye. Have a lovely evening and stay safe. Thank you.